Having reviewed over 250 monitors and considering myself a hardcore competitive gamer, playing a game like Counter-Strike on a day-to-day basis, I was very much curious to see how the Alienware AW2524HF would perform. And that's because it sports a 500Hz panel. Indeed, 500Hz. That's a step up from 240 and indeed 144Hz, which didn't seem to be that long ago since we were talking about them. Now, in terms of its other specification, it has a 24.5-inch Full HD IPS panel that runs, of course, 500Hz over DisplayPort, that is, and then you've also got support for HDR and also adaptive sync technologies. Now, it does not come cheap. In the UK, and at time of filming, it costs a whopping £590, while in the US it costs $650. So in this video, we're going to be comparing it to some of the other high refresh rate monitors that I've reviewed, and also to see if it's actually worth its price tag. Now, I'd also want to make a disclaimer that this is not to be confused with the Alienware AW2524H, therefore omitting the F from the end of the lettering, and that's because the other model has got a native G-Sync module, while this one does not. So I can't actually comment about the performance of the other panel, but looking at some sources online, it do seem to pretty much perform identically. So to kick things off, let's talk about its input lag. And here I had it objectively tested at 1 millisecond, which is indeed very impressive. Now sure enough, if you do look at this graph, you might not think that it does too well, but considering over here the modern gaming panels that I've recently tested actually sit between a range of 0 to 1.6 milliseconds, and you'll quickly realize that these figures are all absolutely incredible. It's surprising to see how far input lag has come in recent times, and in this respect, I do think it's a non-issue on most modern gaming panels. But what about when it comes to the overall total system latency? Now, given this has a 500Hz panel, I do have to talk about frame times. And in this respect, in an ideal scenario, it will actually have a 2 millisecond overall total system latency. And if you do compare this to, let's say, a 240Hz monitor that would sit at 4.1 milliseconds, or a 144Hz monitor that sits at 6.9 milliseconds, you can see here that there is a definite advantage in having a higher refresh rate monitor. Now, by no stretch of the imagination am I an expert in the field of frame time analysis or indeed total system latency. And as such, I've provided some links down in the description below from some other excellent creators out there on YouTube, including some articles. However, I did do a comparison of 300, 240 and 144Hz monitors, looking at it both objectively and subjectively, and indeed also delving into frame time analysis and total system latency. Effectively, the crux of it is the fact that the higher the refresh rate of the monitor and the higher amount of FPS you can output, the better the overall experience should be, at least on paper. However, that is all in an ideal scenario, because here we're going to be talking about this response time, and unfortunately here the Alienware monitor goes absolutely pear-shaped, which actually is pretty shocking to say the least. Now first off, you've got a few different overdrive modes that you can select: fast, super fast and extreme, which I'll be touching upon the differences very shortly. Now using the OSRTT tool, using the fast mode overdrive, you can see that the average initial time sat at 5.12 milliseconds. You can see this at the bottom left hand side of your screen. Now that's actually pretty poor, given the monitor has a 500Hz refresh rate. And indeed, just above it, you can see that the initial response times over here were tested between 1.1 milliseconds to 11.8 milliseconds. Thus why we got an average of 5.12 milliseconds. You can see below over here that the refresh rate sits at 500Hz, with a refresh rate window at 2 milliseconds, as I touched on before, and yet in terms of the amount of times it hits 2 milliseconds, it's sitting at a really disappointing 30%. Now yet again, I'm no expert in this field, but I can certainly say over here that this monitor is not faring well in these tests. Now as I go to the super fast preset, you can see that the percent in window changed to 33.33%, with the average initial time dropping just to 4.56 milliseconds. And on its extreme mode preset, it doesn't improve all that much, with the average initial time sitting at 4.34 milliseconds. So these results are actually quite worrying, not only because of the average initial time being far greater than what it should be, but also because the RGB overshoot sat at 0 between the super fast, fast and even the extreme mode presets, which is pretty much unheard of on an IPS panel. Nonetheless, over here I put it through the UFO ghosting test, and at 500Hz you can be able to see that there are absolutely no differences between the three overdrive modes. Now, just to also double check, I reached out to the creator of the OSRTT tool, which is Andrew from Tech Team GB, for some further insight, and also double checked with my friends Simon from TFT Central and Alan from PC Monitors, just to make sure that everything on my end was done correctly. And indeed it was. Now, just to also clarify, I actually changed DisplayPort cable. I changed a different DisplayPort input on the GPU and on the monitor level, because there's 2 on the monitor and I've got 3 on my RTX 3080. I also made sure that the monitor's drivers were installed, in other words via Windows, and also checked for any sort of firmware updates, which were non-existent. I then also looked at any sort of software that I could install, and unfortunately installed the Alienware Command Center, which was completely pointless and gave me spam notifications. So on a side note, never installed that software. And I also made sure that my GPU drivers were up to date. So effectively on my end, I tried everything possible. I even tried to change the different refresh rates. So in other words, go to 120, 240, 360 or 390 from memory, 480 and 500, and all of which pretty much provided the same sort of experience. In other words, I was not getting any sort of difference in terms of the inverse ghosting, and therefore meant that potentially the results that I was getting at 500 Hz were correct. Now, some people might be able to say, hey, your panel was faulty. And if that was the case, then I've got no means of actually verifying that, because this came directly from Dell or Alienware UK, and you would imagine that that was vetted. It was also a brand new unit, which is not always the case when I'm reviewing monitors, but this was a completely brand new unit. So effectively what I'm trying to say over here is that the response time of this monitor was really, really bad. So much so that it actually really threw me off. Now, this actually translated to my subjective testing as well, because when I was playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, I just felt that the monitor just failed to respond as it should. Now, don't get me wrong, the extra fluidity that I was being able to gain at 500 Hz was certainly appreciated. It's not exactly a night and day difference from my daily driver, which is a 300 Hz 1440p monitor, which sits as the AOC AG274QS, but I still was actually being able to appreciate the 500 Hz fluidity. Still, over here, given its overall response time, it did leave me really disheartened, and therefore really threw me off from actually using this monitor on a day-to-day basis. Furthermore, I was actually disappointed by its overall motion clarity. It wasn't exactly all that good, and some of its competitors over here at lower refresh rates, specifically with certain technologies, for example ULMB, ELMB, or for example DIAC or DIAC Plus, or even MBR on certain monitors, actually do provide a far better experience. And in this respect means that you'll get a sharper image, which will definitely be of concern for hardcore competitive gamers. Now, given this is aimed at sort of the eSports crowd, you would expect that to be the case, but unfortunately that is not, and therefore means that it's completely omitted altogether. Now, it is worth pointing out here that its sibling, the G-Sync module AW2524H, does actually have ULMB mode, which you can enable. However, this only operates at certain refresh rates at up to 360 Hz, which does seem completely pointless and redundant given that you might be getting a 500 Hz monitor for its unique selling point. Still, over here is just something I thought I should mention on this monitor review, and something that you should actually consider if you're going to be comparing and contrasting between some of the other monitors out there on the market, albeit at a different refresh rate. So all of this is extremely disappointing, but it doesn't get as infuriating as my next point, at least not in my opinion. See here, the monitor manufacturer has included a HDMI 2.1 port, at least so it says. When you look at the actual specs, or if you look at the manual, you'll be able to see that the manufacturer even quotes a maximum refresh rate of 255 Hz over said input. Now, delving into it and actually asking my friend Adam from PC Monitors, he actually pointed out it's probably because they have included a half bandwidth or fake HDMI 2.1 port. And I think he's bang on the money over here, because when I was connected over my RTX 3080, which does actually have a full bandwidth 2.1 port, I was outputting a maximum of 255 Hz. While over DisplayPort, I was able to output its native refresh rate of 480 Hz or its overclock of 500 Hz, even at 10-bit. Now, it really baffles me as to why the manufacturer has not just included a full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 port, and the fact that HDMI 2.1 in this respect is being promoted, because it should be completely eradicated. I just think this is really confusing for customers out there looking to understand what HDMI 2.1 actually brings to the table, and in this respect it just confuses the hell out of people and leaves reviewers like myself really infuriated. Now, nonetheless, over here, the HDMI 2.1 or fake HDMI 2.1 spec does bring VRR and HDR technologies, and therefore means over HDMI or DisplayPort, I was able to output HDR simultaneously with NVIDIA G-Sync. Now, just as a reminder, it does not have a native G-Sync module and therefore does not benefit from the full VR range. Instead, it sits from 48 up to 500Hz over DisplayPort and 48 up to 255Hz over HDMI. Now, using the Nvidia Pendulum demo, I didn't incur any sort of black screen issues or flickering. So therefore, in my particular setup, I had no sort of problems in order for me to get that tear-free gaming experience. So past the suboptimal gaming performance, let's talk about its image quality. And if you're still watching, kudos to you. Now, the monitor has got a flat 24.5-inch IPS panel with a matte coating on it. It also has a dedicated sRGB emulation mode that you can select through the monitor's OSD. In said mode, I had it tested via my calibrators with a gamut coverage of 99.2% and 105.2% in gamut volume. You can see below how it compares to the sRGB standard. As for its average delta-E, it sits at 1.64, which isn't too bad, and a maximum of 3.12. Its test contrast ratio sat at 1071 to 1, while its measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sat at 6170 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, it sets relatively close to the 2.2 standard. Now, this means that the monitor can actually be used for some serious image editing work or color grading, alongside of course if you're going to be gaming, but you might want to unlock a wider color gamut, specifically if you're going to be doing the latter. In this respect, on its standard mode preset, I had its gamut coverage and gamut volume retested, and you can see over here that it's positively impacted the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 modes. So much so that I actually put it through its paces in comparison to the DCI-P3 color space, and below you can see how it compares. As for its average delta-E and maximum delta-E, they're actually not too good at 3.78 and 6.38. As for its tested contrast ratio, it does not change. As for its measured white point, it does slightly shift at 6777 Kelvin at 100%. However, you can see that its gamma curve does not shift to the 2.6 standard, therefore showcasing that this monitor is not really tuned for any sort of wide color gamut work. Past color performance, let's talk about its brightness. Now, I did mention that it does have HDR, but it's not particularly impressive. While the overall color performance in HDR wasn't too bad, I only noticed a peak of 382 nits. However, in SDR, it does get still pretty bright at 375 nits, and it does get all the way down to 32 nits, showing great sort of range. Now, in terms of the overall brightness uniformity, I actually expected a little bit better, given it's a 24.5-inch IPS panel. You can see here at the bottom right-hand side of my monitor, it didn't do too well, although I do appreciate it is somewhat panel lottery. The same could be said about backlight bleed, where in my tested panel it was still perfectly acceptable, but given its small form factor, I did actually expect slightly better results. Moving on from all these tests, let's talk about its build quality. And here it's got a 3-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. The stand itself is also very sturdy and provides you height, tilt, swivel and pivot adjustments, showing good sort of versatility. Of course, if you do not want to use the built-in stand, you can replace it via a VESA-compatible stand, allowing you to place it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Elsewhere, you've got a small little headphone stand that props out at the left-hand side of the monitor, a nice little design, at least subjectively, and you've got no nonsensical RGB lights, where I've got no complaints about. Now, in order for you to access the monitor's OSD, there's a small little joystick button found at the center of the monitor or underneath it, and in this respect gives you a comprehensive list of options. It's also very intuitively laid out and responsive. Now, you might have noticed that beside the small little joystick button, there are 2 USB Type-A ports, or USB 3.2 Gen 1 to be more specific. There are further 2 of these ports at the rear of the monitor, and finally, this monitor does not house any sort of speakers, which doesn't bother me in the slightest, but it's just something I thought I should highlight. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict. And here, I was very much excited of getting this Alienware monitor, 500Hz and Counter-Strike, a match made in heaven, or so I thought. Indeed, over here it was actually pretty poor, and from my objective data that I was able to attain, I just was really left absolutely shocked at the overall performance. In fact, it kind of reminds me when I compared 60Hz, 144 and 240Hz monitors, because at the time, the latter was actually quite a novelty and only available in a TN format. Of course, that has very much changed nowadays, but the overall input lag and response time that I was able to attain versus a class-leading 144Hz monitor was actually pretty poor. And I kind of feel the same with this 500Hz monitor. I think it would be far wiser to either get a 240Hz OLED, or for example a 240Hz IPS or TN, or even let's say high refresh rates at let's say 390Hz-ish. In this respect, there are some alternatives that you might want to consider, some of which I've reviewed and will be down in the description below for your own consideration. Now, if you've been watching throughout this video and you've come to this point, I just want to thank you for all your support and your love. And if you do want to extend that, make sure you drop a like, subscribe, and hit that bell notification. All of which are very much appreciated and allows me to continue delivering independent, honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.